الله أكبر الله أكبر. الله أكبر الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله. أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله. حي على الصلاة. حي على الصلاة. حي على الفلاح. حي على الفلاح. الله أكبر الله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله.
إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا. من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له. وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله حق تقاته ولا تموتن إلا وأنتم مسلمون. أوصيكم ونفسي بتقوى الله فإن الله تعالى مع المتقين. وبعد. Imam Malik rahimahullah ta'ala ورضي عنه, he said, لا يصلح آخر هذه الأمة إلا بما صلح به أولها. He said, that which rectified the beginning of this ummah is the only thing which can be used to rectify the end of the ummah. i.e. the formula for success for our nation, the followers of the Prophet Muhammad ibn Abdullah salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi, is one formula. And the approach is one approach. And the blueprint is one blueprint. And so wherever you find success throughout the history of Islam, you will find the same blueprint, the same formula, and the same ingredients for success. That can be found in the beginning of the start of our nation. And this is a point that was discussed over some of the khutbahs that have passed, the difference between the Meccan period and the Madani period, the preparation of the Prophet ﷺ in preparing the Sahaba for that which would come in Medina, and after Medina, after the death of the Prophet ﷺ. We spoke about Banu Israel and the fact that Musa ﷺ and the Prophet ﷺ, that which differed between them was the followership of Banu Israel in comparison to the followership of the Sahaba. Banu Israel said, "Sami'na wa asayna," we hear and we disobey. But the Sahaba said, "Sami'na wa ata'na," we hear and we obey. And of course, when I say Banu Israel, perhaps that's too broad of a term, but the followers from amongst Banu Israel that lived during the time of Musa alayhi salam. And here we have Imam Malik reminding us, rahimahullah ta'ala, that which rectified the beginning of our ummah is the only thing which will rectify the end of our ummah. And so when we look to that which is taking place in the world today, whether we speak about the situation of Gaza and Al-Quds, whether we speak about what has happened in Iraq and Sham, what has happened in Sudan, what has happened in Burma, and so on and so forth, the outcome will always be the same outcome. If we want to change our situation, then we have to look to the earlier generations and follow the formula that they were following in order to rectify what we find ourselves in today. And so what is that formula? And a person who has this intention, the intention of understanding how to revive our ummah, just as the world was revived by the Prophet ﷺ. Abu al-Hasan al-Nadwi rahimahullah ta'ala, he said that the Prophet ﷺ, he was sent to this earth at a time wherein mankind had fallen into a deep darkness. Society was at its worst. Mankind was enslaved to itself. To mankind enslaved to their own desires, the pockets of others, the interests of others, or the interests of self. What was it that the Prophet ﷺ used to bring light to this ummah? The Prophet ﷺ, he said, "Man ja'ahu al-maut wa huwa yatlubu al-ilm liyuhyiya bihi al-islam fabaynahu wa bayna an-nabiyyin fil jannah daraja wahida," aw kama qala alayhi salam. He said, whoever seeks knowledge with the intention of reviving this ummah, reviving Islam, and he passes away in such a state, there is only one station between him and the prophets in Jannah. Only one station between him and the prophets, i.e. he is from the Siddiqeen. And so that which we are discussing now, if a person seeks knowledge in order to follow the way of the Prophet ﷺ in reviving Islam, this person, if they pass away and they're in that state, there's only one station between them and the Prophets ﷺ in Jannah. And if we look to one of the famous ahadith of the Prophet ﷺ, one of the famous statements of the Prophet ﷺ, wherein it's narrated by various companions. Umar radhiyallahu anh is perhaps the most famous narrator of this hadith, and Abu Hurairah radhiyallahu anh, he narrates it from a similar perspective. He said, a man came to the Prophet ﷺ, and he asked the Prophet ﷺ in this variation of the hadith, "Mal iman?" He said to the Prophet ﷺ, "Ya Rasulullah, mal iman?" O Messenger of Allah, what is iman? The Prophet ﷺ, he said, "An tu'mina billahi aw an ta'bud Allah wa la tushrika bihi shay'a," to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala without associating partners to him. "Wa tu'mina bi kitabihi wa bi liqa'ihi wa bi rusulihi wa bi malaikatihi wa bil qadri aw bil ba'ath al-akhir," to believe in his books, in his angels, in his meeting, in his divine decree, and to believe in al-ba'ath al-akhir, the final reckoning, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he brings everyone up from being in the ground, gives them life again after they were dead, so that they can receive their reckoning, to have belief in that. But what does it mean to have iman in these things? It's not to say it with the tongue. It's not to say amantu billah. No, it's to have belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and your action follows your belief. If you believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, why are you putting yourself before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? If you believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and Allah has told you that this is haram, why do you eat it? Why do you drink it? Why do you engage in it? If you believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has requested, instructed that you pray 5 times a day, why do you not pray 5 times a day? If you believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the Prophet ﷺ, he said, the one who controls his anger and does not respond in a time of anger or does not argue even if he is in the right, will have a house built for him in Jannah. Why do you argue? Why do you become angry? That's the type of iman that we are looking for. Iman which leads to amal. But in order to have that type of iman, you have to have what? Ilm, knowledge. How can you do that which you do not know? And if you look to our situation today, the biggest issue we have, the biggest illness that we are currently suffering from is the illness and the issue of jahl, ignorance. That's the biggest issue, ignorance. If you believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and you believe in the last day and you believe in the angels writing down your good deeds and writing down your bad deeds, then you will not leave your family and your children and go off wandering in the world to enjoy yourself. Why? Because you know that you're going to be questioned by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on Yawm al-Qiyamah. You will not steal, you will not lie, you will not cheat, you will not sell drugs, you will not drink alcohol, you will not fornicate. Why? Because you know that you are going to be held accountable by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That was the Sahaba. That's what rectified the beginning of our ummah. Iman that leads to amal. And then this man, he said to the Prophet ﷺ, Ya Rasulullah, mal Islam. The Prophet ﷺ, he said, to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala 5 times a day. To pray 5 times a day. To give zakah. To fast the month of Ramadan. And to perform hajj in some variations of the same hadith. And what is this? This is what? The ritualistic application of Islam. Iman is the internal application, the belief system. And if you have the belief system, that will lead you to the action. No person who knows he's going to stand in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on Yawm al-Qiyamah and be questioned is going to sit and listen to the adhan without praying. But yet travel the Muslim world today and what do you find? The adhan is going off and people are not praying. Look into our homes. You have members of our community that don't pray. Look to the masajid. You have members of the community that only know the masajid on a Jum'ah. Why? Are we not going to be questioned by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Are we not going to be held accountable for the salah? Say the same about the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Quran. Sent to us by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as a rahmah, a mercy, to be followed, a shifa, a cure for the ailments and illnesses that we find within ourselves. But do we read the Quran? Do we have any attachment to the Quran? For those of us that don't know the language, do we have the intention to learn the language of the Quran? Will I not be asked by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on Yawm al-Qiyamah? If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asks me, why did you not implement? I couldn't read, Ya Rabb. Why didn't you learn? Did you have access to those who can teach you? Everyone has access today. Everyone has access today. In Egypt, there are teachers. They will teach you for £25 a month. 3 hours a week. Which of us can't afford that? Very few can't afford £25 a month. The internet has made everything far close. Say the same about zakah. We have those that run away from zakah. They try to hide the wealth that they have. Why? Because they don't want to give. They transfer money into other people's names, or they lend money to people and so on and so forth. Why? So that they can avoid giving zakah. But the one who really puts himself in a position of standing in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on Yawm al-Qiyamah will not run away from these things. In fact, will be the first to do these things. And that again was the Sahaba. And how does this tie to our state today? We cannot stand against any external issues, opponents, problems until we first rectify the internal ones. That's the reality. I cannot get into the ring with a heavyweight boxer and I have not yet fought myself to train, discipline myself, to be committed to training and developing my skills. The real fight for a champion is the fight against the self, not the fight against the opponent. To fight yourself every day, to do the things that you don't like to do. Say the same about Islam. How can I complain about the state of the ummah, yet I allow myself to indulge in the dunya, and I take an easy approach with my deen, and I don't take Islam seriously, and I give myself the excuse of jahl, ignorance. That's the reality of our situation today. I want to cry about Gaza, but yet I'm not taking care of my own children. I want to cry about Islam, but yet I'm not taking care of my spouse. I want to cry about Islam, but yet I have no concern for my society, my community. I want to cry about the masjid being bombed, but yet I'm not in my own masjid. If we want to fix our situation, fix ourselves. Start with ourselves. And that's the bitter pill that we have to swallow. The bitter pill that many of us don't want to swallow. Why? Because it's very easy to blame an external factor, to point fingers at the external reasons. But to recognize the internal problems, a bitter pill to swallow. It's a difficult task. And for many, we are too proud to admit, I am the reason for this. I have made mistakes. I need to change my life. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us what? That He does not change a people until they change what? Themselves. He does not change a people until they change themselves. قُوا أَنفُسَكُمْ وَأَهْلِيكُمْ نَارًا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, protect yourselves and your families from the hellfire. So it makes no sense to raise my voice about something that's happening miles away from me, but yet I am neglecting that which is in front of me. That which is in front of me is the reason why the problems are occurring miles away from me. That's a reality. Does it mean that we sit idly by and silent while our brothers and sisters suffer? Of course not. But if I am serious about changing the situation of my ummah, then I will get serious about changing myself. If I am serious about seeing Islam and its revival, then I will revive Islam in myself and my family first. If not, perhaps I'm saying with my tongue that which I do not do with my own body. We can complain about the rulers and the leaders of Islam, but we are the rulers and the leaders of our own households. How many of us rule and lead in our households by Islam? And then we assume that if we were to become prime ministers and presidents and politicians, we would do a better job than the politicians are doing currently? Perhaps we would be worse. Why? Because we cannot even rule over our own households with Islam. Start with the self. Start with the self. Set an example. Many of us, we don't take care of our duties and our responsibilities, and we point to the duties and responsibilities of others. That was not the Sahaba. That was not the way of the Sahaba. Nor was that the way of the Prophet ﷺ. For example, the Prophet ﷺ had multiple wives and gave each and every wife their due haqq, whilst he was a leader of not only the Muslims but the non-Muslims that lived under Islam in Medina. And he was a military leader. And he was a representative of Islam to the tribes that used to come to visit him, and so on and so forth. Us today, we are not even giving due rights to our one wife. And then we have many of us, we talk about wanting a second wife, not because we're thinking about the society and the community, but because we're thinking about our private parts and our desires. It all adds up. The Prophet ﷺ, he said, he was asked by this man who came to him, Ya Rasulullah, وَمَا الْإِحْسَانِ قال أن تعبد الله, and in another variation of the same hadith, أن تخشى الله, to worship Allah, or to have khashya of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to have an understanding of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in your life, to know that He is constantly holding you account. كأنك ترى فإن لا تكن تراه فإنه يراك. If you don't see him, he sees you. This is the framework of Islam. 3 areas that we need to focus on. Al-Iman wal-Islam wal-Ihsan. Or Al-Islam wal-Iman wal-Ihsan. The ritual rights of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be given. The theological rights of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be given and to be internalized. And the spiritual rights of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be given. And to give Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala His rights, I have to also give the people their rights. Society its rights. My family their rights. My brothers and sisters in Islam their rights. And the question that we can ask ourselves, what is it that prevents me from doing so? Why is it that I'm unable to do all of these things? Even though they sound very basic in statement, why can I not give Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala His due right? My family their due right? Society its due right? Why? What's stopping me? One answer. Dunya. That's it. Dunya. Love of this life. Love of desire. Love of comfort. Inclination towards that which makes me feel good. Momentarily. The pleasures and the luxuries. Until I'm able to give those things up, I'm going to continue to struggle and suffer. And don't think that as an individual, I don't make a difference. No, every single one of us, we make a difference. Every single one of us, we make a difference. Especially the young men and the young women. And we need young men and young women now who are ready to dedicate themselves to the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. To study it, to teach it. Willing to sacrifice themselves for the sake of reviving Islam. To take the baton that was handed to our generation by the generations that came before us. This is a need. And we need to raise our children upon that. Raise our children with the intention and the mindset that I want to work for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Work for the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Sacrifice myself for the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Not for the sake of acquiring this life that is temporary. A house and a car and a family and so on and so forth. No. If we do not wake up now, when will we wake up? We have to reflect over ourselves. Reflect over our responsibilities. Reflect over our duties. Reflect over our relationship with Islam, with Iman, with Ihsan. When we see what's taking place in Gaza and around the world, we have to think about ourselves. What part am I playing in this? What part can I play? أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم ولسائر المسلمين فاستغفروه إنه هو الغفور الرحيم. بسم الله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. There was yesterday a threat made to a masjid in East London Mosque. They received a credible threat. I'm not sure what the threat was exactly. I was informed that it was a bomb threat. Allah knows best. It didn't last for very long, alhamdulillah. They evacuated the masjid and everyone came back. What I would like to say about this is that we as Muslims have to be ready to face any difficulties ahead for the sake of Islam and application of the deen. If I die in a masjid worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what better death is there than that? If I'm in the masjid and someone comes to the masjid and tries to take my life and they are successful, what better death is there for me than that? I will be raised on Yawm al-Qiyamah doing what? Worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in one of His houses. And so, if we hear about threats being made to masajid, that should not scare us. In fact, that should lead us to filling up the masajid. Why? Because we should say to ourselves, if anyone is going to die in a state of worship, I don't want to lose out. I don't want to hear that people lost their lives worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and I was not from amongst them. That's the mindset of the Sahaba. The Sahaba did not look to those who lost their life in the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and feel sorry for them. They felt sorry for themselves. And so if anyone makes a threat to any of our masajid, that should increase our attachment to the masajid. I should find myself in the masjid more often. And I should not be scared of being in the house of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala if a threat is made. So what? I'm going to die anyway. No one can bring my death to me before my time. And no one can take my death away from me if it's my time. That's the mindset that we need to have. That we are willing to die for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's sake. We are willing to die in worship. In fact, we will be happy to die in worship. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make our deaths the best of deaths and our final action the best of actions. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما صليت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم إنك حميد مجيد وارض اللهم عن أبي بكر وعن عمر وعن عثمان وعن علي وعن سائر أصحابه أجمعين. اللهم تب علينا واعف عنا إنك أنت مجيب الدعوات. اللهم تقبل منا وجعلنا من المخلصين لك يا رب العالمين. اللهم انصر إخواننا في فلسطين. اللهم انصر أهل غزة. اللهم ثبت قلوبهم. اللهم ارفع رايتهم. اللهم سدد رميهم. اللهم عليك بالظالمين المحتلين. اللهم خذهم أخذ عزيز مقتدر وانتقم منهم فإنك أنت المنتقم. وأقم الصلاة. السلام عليكم.